Hello, and welcome to Designers at Home. I am Mark Weaver. Today we're going to be talking with best-selling author Carolyn Campbell and her book, City of Immortals, Père-Lachaise Cemetery, Paris. She'll be joining us shortly. But let me tell you a little bit about Carolyn. She's a fascinating woman. Carolyn is a native of Washington, D.C., and is a published writer and exhibited photographer who's now based in Los Angeles. Her photographic images have included shows in London, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami. Her decades-long writing and photo passion, City of Immortals, Père-Lachaise Cemetery, was published by Goff Books and named number 2 on the Los Angeles Times bestsellers list, and also as number 1 on Amazon's hot new release. Her book tour for this has continued on Zoom. She's a summa cum laude graduate of the Maryland Institute College of Art and has written about the arts and culture in her roles as an executive in major cultural institutions on the East and West Coasts. She was appointed as the first director of public relations and special events at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She subsequently held positions at the American Film Institute and the University of California at Los Angeles School of the Arts and Architecture. She's contributed essays and images to several books and has been sought out as a lecturer on the subject of communication in the arts. So we're going to ask Carolyn to join us right now. She'll be here. So I'm glad you're all here. I think you're going to find this fascinating. So Carolyn, there you are. Hello.
Good morning.
You look very pretty this morning.
Thank you. So do you.
Thank you.
Handsome.
And I'd like to wish you a happy birthday.
Well, thank you.
And so, last week I was speaking with Eric Peterson, the architect, and he was celebrating his 50th birthday last week. And it's a little strange coincidence. Today is your birthday, and we have the opportunity to talk to you. So thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. It's a Virgo fest. Meanwhile, I need to turn up the sound somehow. My volume is low. I'm not quite sure how to do that.
You can turn your volume up just on your phone like you normally would turn the volume up.
Yeah, let's see how that is going to work here. I'm not sure which of the commands is going to do that. It's all the way up. Well, okay, I'll need to listen closely to you. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, I can hear you fine. I think my volume is up. Is this better? No? Okay.
No. I can hear you very faintly, but I'll listen closely.
Okay. All right. I'll try and speak up a little bit. So, Carolyn, when was the first time you remember setting foot in a cemetery?
It was age 11, and my mother said, Carolyn, put on your best dress. As I remember telling you, we're going to go to your granddaddy Owen's funeral today. I didn't know it, but it was going to be at Arlington National Cemetery.
Wow.
He was a member of the military, so I had no idea what I was getting into.
And what was it in particular that day that stuck out in your memory?
Mark, there was so much tradition that I had no idea. It was a beautiful horse-drawn carriage. I guess they call it a caisson.
Yes.
And his casket was there with a flag draped over it. The horses' manes are waving in the wind. And when we got to this ceremony itself, there were all these gorgeous soldiers with braids and sabers, and it was just so much ceremony. And of course, what I wasn't expecting at the end of it, there would be a 21-gun salute. He was a lieutenant colonel, so he was getting full military honors. And that was followed by the bugler playing taps. That was my initiation into grief. It was pretty powerful.
And your first steps in the world of death began when you started a meditation practice on death and impermanence. So how did that come about? Because this all has an effect on you ultimately writing this extraordinary book?
I had a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and his practice was about being in the present. And part of that was really understanding the impact of what death meant.
Yes.
And it was a kind of this incredible paradox of what's important, how do you spend your time, what is really informs your life. So it was always this juxtaposition of death when there is nothing and life when there is. And what became evident to me that how I lived my life was the most important and how I made those important choices.
Yes.
So it was probably the most intense part of it was when my father, who, not unlike me, always wanted to be a writer, and he spent his life, instead of writing, taking care of his three daughters, sending them to private schools, universities, and when he retired, he got cancer and was dying. So when I went back east to visit him, he told me literally on his deathbed, Carolyn, never put off your dreams. So that was the real living message I got that from this man who I was more like than anything, to never put off my dreams. So
Well, that's wonderful that he left you with that at the final time. That's really wonderful. Um, so when did your love of design and architecture begin?
I was born and raised in Washington, D.C.,
Yes.
and at the time I had no idea that it was designed by a Frenchman. So the French connection was early. Charles L'Enfant designed those beautiful broad boulevards, Constitution Avenue, Independence Avenue, beautiful monuments to culture, and then, of course, as a young kid, I took art lessons at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, which is catty corner from the East Wing of the White House,
Yes.
which was a beautiful Beaux-Arts building.
It's a spectacular building.
Yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright called it the best example of Beaux-Arts architecture in the
Right.
country. So early on, the imprint of architecture was in my life and design.
Uh, so were there other architectural elements or architectural monuments that stuck out in your mind as a young person?
Well, later on, many years later, I had the opportunity to work at the Corcoran. So
Yeah.
not from as a kid. I was a little 8 years old. I was wandering around, but as working there full time, I really took in all of the details. I would walk across this 2-story tall, 40-foot atrium with these tall Doric columns, beautiful skylit, again, interior Beaux-Arts design throughout. And of course, the Washington Monument,
Yes.
classic Egyptian revival with
Right.
the obelisk. So Washington was a great learning ground for my design love.
Yeah, it's a wonderful city. So we're here to discuss your wonderful book and the Père-Lachaise Cemetery. So I in reading your book, you said that the Père-Lachaise is literally an outdoor museum of art and design. And the thing that sort of surprised me, it attracts more than 3.5 million people annually, and it's the fourth most popular destination for people visiting Paris after the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame, and the Arc de Triomphe. That's amazing to me. Until I met you, I had never heard of Père-Lachaise. So why do you think so many people are drawn to this cemetery?
Mark, I think probably predominantly because of its historical and cultural significance.
Mm-hmm.
It was founded in 1804 through a decree by Napoleon, who loved Paris, was very committed to the design of Paris, and understood that there was no more room for dead people. They had, between the plagues and the revolution, and he literally designated to all of his engineers, we've got to solve the problem of the overpopulation. And he decreed that there would be no more cemetery burials in a churchyard, which was the tradition, but we had to build new cemeteries out in the countryside of Paris. So it was quite a revolution.
And what was it initially that drew you to the cemetery?
Oddly enough, I hadn't really planned to go to Paris. This was in the early 80s, but the conservator at the Corcoran did kind of a night duty as a travel agent. And one evening he said, Carolyn, I've got a cancellation on a charter. Would you like a ticket to Paris? And all you have to do is pay the tax. And I went, oh, that'd be a yes. So later on that evening, I met an artist friend at a gallery opening, and he said, Carolyn, I hear you're going to Paris. I said, yes. He says, you have to go to Père-Lachaise Cemetery. And I went, a cemetery? That really wasn't the plan I had for visiting Paris. He goes, well, don't you love Oscar Wilde? And I said, yes, he's my favorite writer. He goes, my ancestor, Sir Jacob Epstein, built his tomb. And I said, my first destination. So that's what drove me there. It was Oscar Wilde.
Well, there's so many famous people that are buried in the cemetery. We'll talk about the architecture and how this developed, but there's so many incredible people just in the world of arts that are buried there. So can you talk a little bit about them and and tell me, we know that Oscar Wilde was one of your favorites, but let's talk about who else is there.
It's literally the salon of the afterlife. Everybody who was anybody from the 1800s forward were buried there. From the writers alone, Oscar Wilde, of course, Apollinaire, Colette, Gertrude Stein, Marcel Proust. Then from the music world, there was Bellini, Cherubini, Chopin, and of course Jim Morrison of the Doors, bringing it up to the present. And yes, the visual artists, there's Marie Laurencin, Delacroix, Modigliani, Jericho. I include 84 people in the book. I mean, and then wow, that I cut it off at 84. I could have gone on and on.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, and it spans how many years, Carolyn?
Well, it was. I think that, of course, to make the place popular, the Nicolas Frochot, who was kind of the marketing man for Père-Lachaise, because it wasn't a very popular idea to have to trek out to the countryside for a funeral. So he got the remains of Molière and La Fontaine. He also bartered for some noble bones, got the ashes of Heloise and Abelard, and he peppered some, fabulous sculptures in the grounds. So that set the stage. Now they date way back. I mean, Heloise and Abelard, I think, of the 12th century. But right, pretty much from the early 1800s right to the present, people are still being buried there today. Marcel Marceau is there.
Right.
A lot of famous people.
So to quote you, you said, if the word necropolis means city of the dead, then Père-Lachaise is indeed the city of immortals. The deceased within its walls do not rest, but live forever. With the names of the people that you just mentioned, these are people that throughout history have inspired and really continue to inspire us. We still read their works. We still admire their architecture. We love seeing their art. I mean, it's very important. Some people think of death in cemeteries as something very morbid. Personally, I see it as a celebration of life. It's part of life. Mm-hmm. And I was very interested when you earlier were talking about your background with your Buddhist teachings. But it's to visit some place like this, I don't find it morbid in the least. I find it uplifting, inspiring, because these are people that we, like we said, we celebrate today. So when you were writing your book and doing research on your book, was there anything in particular that surprised you?
Many things, but from a design standpoint, I was totally unaware that the tradition up until that point had always been for people to be buried either within the church or on the church grounds.
Right.
There was nothing like we have today, these large cemeteries. So I don't think the architects really get the credit for the radical departure of creating these garden-style cemeteries, which were in fact, instead of these drab, dreary, creepy places filled with dead people, it was a celebration. It right. was a nature and a very pantheistic view of the divine in nature and the spiritual mm-hmm. in nature. And early on, the earliest interpretation of the word cimetière is a place where one sleeps. So it's
Oh,
really this
that's
idyllic
lovely.
environment. Certainly when you walk through any cemetery, certainly now with the pandemic and you distancing, it's an open space where you have the time for contemplation and memories, and mostly
Right.
good memories of
Good
people who have
memories.
departed.
Yes, I think that's why people visit cemeteries, is to reflect on their own lives and
Yes,
to think about those that have passed, and really think how wonderful it is that they've added to our lives, and
exactly,
enriched our lives.
exactly.
So the architects that are associated with Père-Lachaise throughout, I guess, when it was first created, and can you talk a little bit about which architects, how this got started? Because I know in discussing with you, I was surprised that Boule, who I've always associated with furniture design, and as a decorator, I bought many Boule pieces for projects of ours, but I wasn't really familiar with his architectural background.
Well, the French architects, many did because they were commissioned by the wealthy families, and not only did they want them to build beautiful apartments and homes, but the furnishings. So people did do a lot of double duty. But Boulet's kind of lead student was Alexander Brongniart, and Brongniart won the commission to design Père Lachaise. Now, this was unheard of. Usually it was a city engineer or working with the church to lay out the burial grounds, but this was a first. Brongniart was also a landscape designer in addition to being a
Right.
really well-known architect. So the phenomena was set that this was going to be something very different. And he was just the beginning, because following his passing in, I guess, 1813, Hippolyte Gode, he took over as the follow-up architect, and he built the beautiful horseshoe-shaped grand entrance to the cemetery. He was also became the head of the city architecture for Paris. So they had such a rich group to choose from for all of these families to commission tombs and mausoleums, and just the cemetery design itself was phenomenal and revolutionary, again, because it had
Yes,
never been done
and had
before.
a profound effect on um, other cemeteries around the world, and the influence that it had. So,
Literally every American cemetery, even those in Europe, Highgate Cemetery in London is a garden style cemetery.
right.
We've talked about our passions about, I love Bonaventure in Savannah, Georgia, which is a 19th century cemetery, if you can believe it, with Spanish moss and the Savannah River running by it. So they're very bucolic environments. I was never a fan of them before, but if I go to a city, I make a beeline to the cemetery. It tells you everything about their history. It really does.
Yes, yes. So this particular cemetery has extraordinary architecture. It has extraordinary monuments. And in looking at your book and reading it, there's some wonderful photographs in the book, by the way.
Thank you.
So to document this, so it's not just it's they're inspiring. So let's talk about some of the monuments and sculpture within there that you found particularly important or inspiring.
When you first walk in the front gates, off to your right is this beautiful Art Nouveau tomb. I only saw two in the entire cemetery. It was a dove gray marble with swooping lines and beautiful oxidized iron, typically Art Nouveau, organic floral
Hmm.
shapes. And I later discovered, because there was an atelier stamp at the very back, people should go when they go, look around for the signatures of the artists and the architects. They're usually on the tomb. And there was Hector Guimard. And I did some research and I said, this name is familiar. Well, he designed all of the metro stations throughout Paris, which are
Oh, of course.
beautifully Art
Uh-huh.
Nouveau, with the lettering and the scroll work on the fencing around it, a real celebration, all those beautiful arched lamps that are around the cemetery. So Guimard, in fact, was very influenced
Mm-hmm.
by Viollet-le-Duc, who was the leading architecture historian and architect in Paris at the period. He worked on Notre Dame, but he also was commissioned to create this ornate mausoleum for the Duc de Mornay. And this one is a must-see there. I think Viollet-le-Duc put in every architectural treatment he's ever thought of. It has ornate finials and uh, great windows, and literally, to me, it looks like an aging wedding cake. He's put so much on it, and it's so overdone, but it's a classic piece there. I mean, there's 107 acres, so you can
Yeah,
imagine
it's massive.
it's literally an open air museum of architecture.
Right.
There's so much to see.
So you mentioned that you were drawn to the cemetery by your favorite writer, Oscar Wilde. So tell us about his monument.
That had a fascinating. Jacob Epstein had a rather racy reputation for making very sensual sculptures.
Oh,
He
really?
had very robust male figures on a medical building in London, which really caused a stir. And we're talking about the early 1900s here. So this is not, this is still borderline, it's still very, very much a Victorian age.
Yes.
So they had, I think, a 20-ton piece of limestone installed in the cemetery, and he worked on it on site. And it is a winged Assyrian bull with the face of, it looks very kind of Egyptian, but it's an Assyrian, but was very prominent about it. And it's mega life size. It had very prominent male parts on it.
Uh-huh.
So Oscar was had a lot of kind of glory in the afterlife, as it were. But it was initially, it was censored. They put a tarp over it.
Oh, you're kidding.
And
Yes.
Robbie Ross, who was Oscar Wilde's first lover, was irate that they had censored the tomb, and he
Right.
refused to come to the unveiling. But later on, obviously, as society got used to it, they took the tarp down, and it is now probably one of the most highly visited cemeteries, rather tombs in the
Tombs
cemetery.
with, yeah. So, you mentioned to me the other day the imagery that is used throughout the cemetery on monuments and tombs. So, and I found it fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There is a whole encyclopedia of funerary iconography. And
Yes.
when you look at a tomb, you think, oh, well, that's interesting. They put this flower or they put this animal. They all have meanings. And there's a significance to everything. On Rosa Bonheur's tomb, favorite painter of the 19th century Vermont, is a big palm frond. And I thought, what is the palm frond for? Well, she is buried in the tomb with two of her women friends. And the palm was justice. And I thought, right on, Rosa. She really made her statement.
Yes.
She and her girlfriends were in that tomb. She designed the tomb. There are lots of animals. A lion on a tomb, usually represented a male, would be courage.
Right.
A dog. There's one at the feet of Heloise and Abelard, symbolized fidelity. The pansy flower is for the French word penser, or to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So there's endless. I mean, I love all the bats. I mean, there are some spooky ones. There's lots of skulls and so forth. But again, when they started to move towards this more bucolic idea, the cherubs and the angels started to appear.
Right.
So
Right.
their angel kind of roughly translate as like a messenger to God. So lots of angels. There's endless. The book, I probably put a fraction of the symbols in the book, but there are many. So it's worth exploring when you go to a cemetery to identify what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember on a visit to Italy, I was at the Canova Gypsoteca. It's a museum in the town of Pisagno, one of my favorite places. And I remember the maquette for a tomb. I'm not sure who it was for, but somebody of wealth or nobility. And I was in a church in Venice, and I saw the actual tomb there.
Ah,
And I don't recall now, this was many years ago, but everything on the tomb itself, the figures, the imagery is all representative of important times and things of his life. So it's really fascinating.
It's
So
like a treasure hunt. It
it
really
is.
is.
It is. Yeah. Um, so this cemetery, can you tell us a little bit about the landscaping? Um, because it is a park-like setting.
Exactly. The original property belonged to a Jesuit priest. His name was Father Lachaise, and obviously they took the publicity and named it after him. He was the confessor to Louis XIV, the Sun King.
Yes.
And supposedly the story has it that Louis, as a gift for Father Lachaise for forgiving him all of his sins, gave him this beautiful property. And the original cemetery was 16 acres, and it was beautiful. It had was again, Père-Lachaise is one of 4 mountains in Paris. Who knew there were mountains in Paris? There's Montmartre, Montparnasse, and it was Mont Louis. It's 1,000 feet elevation. So it's really is, if you're walking there, be in good shape. I always go to the gym for weeks before I visit. You have to do a lot of strenuous hiking in the hills, but it is rolling hills with gardens. There's 5,000 trees in the cemetery. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of birds, flowers, and it's beautifully landscaped, and everyone usually tends to the graves by putting lovely plantings, small trees. Marie Laurencin has a little lovely blooming tree that comes right out of the middle of the plot on her tomb. So
Oh,
it's a breathtaking, it is the largest green space, open green space in Paris. So
wonderful.
Luxembourg Gardens, everything, nothing competes with Père Lachaise.
No.
It's quite, it's quite beautiful.
Yes. So you mentioned a little earlier the Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. I know that one that sticks out in my mind, and I haven't visited this yet, my family being Italian and knowing my love of art and architecture said, Mark, you must visit in Genoa, Italy, where my family's from, the Cimitero, and I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this, Staglieno? Staglieno?
Close. I think I don't know either. Stagliano or something. They
Yes,
would know what we're
anyway.
talking about if you said
Yeah,
it.
and it's just I've done a little research on it, and the
Mm.
of course the Italians created all these monuments and sculptures. They're just breathtaking. And in reading about it the other day, I found that Constance Wilde, Oscar Wilde's wife, was buried there.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, we have to. This is our bucket list,
Right.
Mark.
So we have a
The
little
two of
research
us.
to do. So he had his boyfriends in Paris and I guess his wife in Genoa. So,
That's why we love Oscar.
yes, exactly. And, a friend of mine was telling me about the famous cemetery in Buenos Aires, and I guess this is a real gem. Is it Recoleta? Recoleta?
Recoleta, yes.
Yes. And have you visited that?
I have not. I had planned to, but I had a bad back, and the doctor said you'll never survive 16 hours of the flight. But my family went there for a wedding. But it's very different from, say, from Père Lachaise, which even though it's a garden cemetery and it's very urban because it has pathways and street signs and little, Recoleta is very much an urban cemetery. It's not a lot of green space, but rows and rows of beautiful monuments. Eva Peron is buried there. It has its fair
Right.
share of
Uh-huh.
celebrities,
Right.
but it's again, it's on the wish list. It is a phenomenal cemetery for people who are making their lists.
Right. So through all this research and your visits, how did the book come about?
I had the good fortune of having a long-time friendship with Michael Webb, who I'm sure you know is a well-known author of
Mhm.
architecture and design books. And he had heard about, initially before the book, long before the book came out, I started to design a map because 107 acres, if you've got so much time, you eventually get lost, which is part of the fun. It's getting lost in Père-Lachaise is great. So I started to make a map and I designed it and published it. And Michael said, why don't you come? I think I'd like to do a review of it for Form Magazine, just because cartography and it really significantly pointed out key architecture. So I was having tea at his apartment, and he said, Carolyn, this is really phenomenal work. And I said, well, thank you. And I said, well, look to see, I just made an app for a GPS tour. And he goes, an app? So I showed him, again, I launched the app a couple years ago. He said, you've got an app, you've got a map, you've all this research, and you've got all these pictures. Why don't you do a book? I said, yeah, your lips to God's ears. What writer or photographer doesn't want to do a book? And he said, well, why don't I introduce you to my publisher? And I said, that would be great. So he rang up Gordon Goff at Oro Editions, and there is a imprint of Oro called Goff Books, which
Yes.
does specialty books, travel, and specific things. Oro is known for its wonderful architecture
Right.
books. And Gordon and I had a chat. Within 2 weeks, he sent me a contract, and I had a book deal. So I think it's what's meant to be is meant to be, a 30-year arc, and it happened. So thank you, Michael.
Well, congratulations. It's a fascinating book. And I hope that everybody that's listening today will get a copy of this book, because it really is great. And I know that on my next trip to Paris, I'm going to be visiting Père-Lachaise.
Have you repeat that? A call came in and it froze. You tech stuff we love to hate.
Oh,
so
sorry. No, I said congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I think it's very inspiring. And on my next visit to Paris, this is a destination for me. So, closer to home and bringing it up into more modern times, here in Southern California, we have a couple notable cemeteries, and probably not so much because they're great architectural significance, but because of the people that are buried there. For instance, Hollywood Memorial Park. And, this has become a place that they show films there. Young people go there to watch films. They're bringing people into the cemetery. It's a celebration of the people that are there.
Well, they've really, it's almost a cultural destination. And the owners of it have done a beautiful job of restoring it. I think Hollywood Forever was kind of on the downslide for many decades. And this family, I think the Cassidy family, came in and invested $1 million to restore it. Their Dia de los Muertos celebration is legendary. But they have, I think, Tyrone Power is there. Oh my goodness, Johnny Ramone, the Ramones of the rock and roll group.
Right.
Now I'm going to be stuck. What are the names? But again, it's a big,
right,
wonderful.
And the same Westwood Memorial Park in Westwood. There's Marilyn Monroe, Natalie Wood, Ray Bradbury, Gene Kelly, and Tom Petty. I mean, these are places that people visit, and they're going to celebrate the memories and the lives of these people. So anyway, Carolyn, this is really fascinating. I think it's very interesting, and I hope it's inspired people to go out and buy your wonderful book. And thank you for joining us, and I wish you the happiest of birthdays, and thank you again.
Can I mention to people how they can find the book?
Sure. Can you tell us how they can find
Absolutely.
this, please? Yes.
On my website, cityofimmortals.com, which is the title of the book.
Yes.
They can order it through Amazon, or I have some signed copies up at Book Soup on Sunset. They do curb drop-off, so you can pull right up. And the app will be coming out in French shortly, so for all the Francophiles out there. And I want to thank the people who have purchased it, because it became a bestseller, which, thank you, Dad. I haven't put off my dreams.
How wonderful he inspired you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our visit with Carolyn. Our next guest is going to be on the 25th, and we will be talking with Darren Franks, who's the president of the Southern California chapter of the ICAA. The ICAA is the Institute of Classical Architecture and Arts, and their mission is to advance the appreciation and practice of the principles of traditional architecture and applied arts. This organization has wonderful programs, lectures, events. You should do a little research. You might be anxious to join the ICAA. It's a wonderful organization. So also, please share your talks or our talks with your friends. We are live on Instagram, and you can follow us anytime by visiting our Instagram or YouTube page under Mark Weaver and Associates. So from the wonderful world of design, I am Mark Weaver, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.